squarely, you can't really point a finger squarely, but points the finger at industrial capitalism. Chadwick does precisely the reverse. He tries to say, look, it doesn't really matter where these questions come from. We have to address the system of sanitation on its own terms. We have to create this thing and separate out an understanding that it might be connected to political or economic forces. And what that means, as you saw in the lecture that I did on the state, was that the social domain that people like Chadwick identified became increasingly an excuse for intervening upon particular groups of people, particular problems and particular groups of people. So it's a very long way from an idea of organic society that embraces everybody. Now you have an idea of social problems as being very specific and very unique to particular groups of individuals. Bear with me, you'll get this as I go on. I know it's difficult. Now, why then did this social domain become a problem in the late 19th century? If Chadwick had been this great reformer who was going to set it all straight from the 1830s, 1840s and 1850s. Well, one of the reasons is that the very techniques used to promote and illustrate the forward march of liberal progress, all those statistics, all those inspectors that were running around trying to do the work that Chadwick had started, tended to bring in evidence of the consistent failures of that scheme. That is to say that rather than illustrating the forward march of liberal progress, what the state was and the public were continually confronted was by its shortcomings, those people that were being left behind and not being lifted out of their social difficulties. The other reason why the social problem becomes increasingly important in the late 19th century is of the understanding that poverty was becoming increasingly structural in nature. Okay? That there were specific groups of people who could not lift themselves out of poverty. And that not just was poverty structural, it was often or increasingly seen as a consequence of those series of systemic failures of the marketplace that I've talked about. The Irish famine was the first one, the cotton famine in the 1860s was the other, and the Great Depression of the 1870s. Okay, so those series of great economic crises led to a real evaluation of the terms of liberal political economy and the recognition that people were not always in charge of the conditions in which they lived. Now, as I said, what that means is that you have an increasing interest in trying to understand whether this social domain has its own rhythms and laws that have to be understood. Okay? And how is it that you can think of, particularly in the context of gathering economic gloom, whether you can think of the social domain as the key intermediary between economics and politics. Okay? And that is essentially how we still more or less think, that you have these economic trends, they produce certain social patterns, and they give rise to different political formations. We still effectively think in those terms. And so in the context of the late 19th century, people were concerned, increasingly concerned, that economic crises would lead to political upheaval. Okay? Bear in mind that this is a time of the expanding franchise, the potential working mobilization of working men. So a big part of this work was trying to think, okay, if we can secure this thing in the middle called the social, then we might be able to mediate between these economic difficulties and the prospect of political upheaval. The last point I want to make here is that increasingly this study of society that begins to gather force begins to understand society as having a certain structure. And that structure is increasingly thought of in terms of social classes, of coherent blocks of people, understood in terms of different classes. And that's going to become very, very important, both politically and socially, over the next month of my lectures. Sorry, I should go back. My really last point on this slide is that what social reformers of the late Victorian period want to do then is to move away from this idea that social reform is about targeting specific problematic groups, and instead should be about trying to make society coherent again, to try and rebuild the bonds of solidarity and of community. Okay, so there's it's very slow, it's very uneven, but there's the beginning of a basis of a completely different understanding of the social. Okay, any questions? Because I know that's all very abstract, and now I'm going to try and make it much more concrete in a series of utterly boring sections of the lecture, but hopefully it will become more apparent. Any questions on any of that stuff? Yeah. Say the question again. Right, a sphere of action, I was saying. That what Chadwick was concerned about was not society as a whole. What he was interested in thinking was in intervening on this social domain and of making social reforms that would cure specific problems like sanitation, like poverty, but not of thinking it as all joined up and as a system that connected people at the very bottom to the people at the very top, which is how we think of society as sort of, as a collective, as a coherent group. Any other questions? Okay, so now we're going to move into this second section of the lecture, which is really looking at who discovered the social problem, who did all of these investigations that made poverty so much more visible in the late 19th century. And I'm going to do this in 3 sections. I'm going to do this by talking very briefly now about the role that this plays in the emergence of the modern social sciences, and then I'm going to talk about the 2 distinctive methods that emerge out of this work that I think continue to shape most of what the social scientists continue to do today. So if you think of the social sciences on this campus, okay, you would think of the Department of Anthropology, Department of Sociology, maybe the School of Public Health. We don't have a School of Town Planning, but in Britain many universities would have that. And I'm going to suggest to you that these disciplines emerge out of the process of investigating social problems in the late 19th century. Now, clearly, this isn't just a British affair. Okay, this is also happening in Germany, in France, and in the US at around the same time. But it has a very particular type of flavour in the UK. And as I said at the beginning, what this work was about, what the emergence of these new groups of people who increasingly thought of themselves as scientists who could study these social problems, what they wanted to do was discover the laws that would enable them to solve social problems, okay? To try and make a positive intervention upon society. Okay, so the social sciences, I'm suggesting, emerge as a type of activist knowledge, okay, trying to actively shape the conditions of the society in which they live. Now, they also begin to organize themselves institutionally, okay, and this is a sure sign of the professionalization of social sciences, that you begin to get these new academic institutions and organizations. And so the first and the earliest, which is a very amateur organization in the sense that there's a wide divergence of people who participated in the Social Science Association from 1853. You know, from politicians to economists, I mean, very eclectic group of people involved. Probably much, much more familiar in terms of the contemporary landscape would be the formation of the London School of Economics in 1895, which basically emerged out of precisely this type of attempt to develop the social sciences and to think of their application on the development of the state, and the Sociological Society that was founded in Britain in 1904. Okay, so let's look at this first set of methods that I'm going to suggest continues to be so important. I'm being chased by a bug. It's the qualitative method of research. I bet that some of you have all done a course on the qualitative and quantitative methods. Have you? Have we got any anthro or sociology majors in the room? No? Yeah? Have you done a class like that? Thank you. Thank you for making my point. I was I don't know what I would have done if someone, no, I haven't done that. Okay, so the qualitative method. Now, the qualitative method is the method that seems immediately the least scientific in form, okay? And indeed, a big part of the struggle of disciplines that use qualitative methods of research is trying to develop a methodology that makes them scientific, okay? Now, in the British case, what I'm suggesting these come out of is a series of sensational exposures of the degree of poverty, almost always in London. Okay? It's always about what we would call investigative journalists going in and discovering how rife poverty was in the richest city in the world. Okay, and I'm giving you three good examples of that. The first is Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, which this image of the crippled street bird seller comes from, which comes out, is serialised in the Morning Chronicle from 1851. The best, I think, is the one that you've all been reading that we'll talk about in a minute, which is Andrew Mearns' A Bitter Cry of Outcast London, published in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1883. And then I've just put down Booth, not because it's a great example of this, but because you read it last week. And to make the point that it's not just journalists who are running around doing this. This is also about people setting up their own campaigns and organisations to solve the social problem through a variety of perspectives. Now, what this means, what this work does, depends upon what social scientists now call participant observation. It demands the person doing the investigation to basically get up